We've dropped out of the great conversation. We've lost our ability to converse with the rest of the natural world. We're talking only to ourselves. He complained, we're not talking to the rivers. We aren't listening to the wind and stars. We've broken the great conversation.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Evangelical podcast where being labeled a heretic is a good thing, if it means refusing to conform to toxic, harmful expressions of faith. We address your questions about God, politics, how we got here, and how to move forward. Nothing is off limits in our conversations with scholars, spiritual seekers, and activists in our quest to uncover the heart of faith. We're your hosts, Melanie
and Gary Allen,
and this is Holy Heretics. Before we get started, we have something brand new that we wanted to tell you, our listeners, about first. For so many of us who really find ourselves questioning the faith we were given, the Bible really becomes a sticking point. Can we even trust it? Is it inerrant? If it's not, does that mean we should just totally throw it out? Should we even read it anymore? If so, how do we read it? And what about all the different translations? I mean, the questions can become overwhelming and really confusing. And so because of our own questions, we started digging and then decided to turn all our research into a live course that we're calling Making Sense of the Bible Post-Deconstruction. And we will be debuting it in July. Because we want this course to have time for questions and dialogue, we are only opening it up to our Patreon supporters, and it's on a first-come, first-served basis. So between now and June 30th, 2021, if you become a monthly Patreon patron, we will reserve your seat for the course. So head to our website, which is holyheretics.org, and click on the button that says support on Patreon, or head straight to patreon.com/holyheretics to become a patron of any amount and reserve your spot before they're gone. Now let's get started. For many of us in the deconstruction world, we have a desire to walk away from toxic religion and from fundamentalism, but we have no intention of giving up faith altogether. And we still believe in Jesus, and many of us are just longing for a deeper, more transformative faith, one that really goes far beyond the rigid confines of religion that we were taught. And so that's why we're delighted to have Professor Belden C. with us today. He has tapped into some unique ways to feed his soul and to connect with the divine. So we are hoping to glean from some of his experience and wisdom today. Professor Lane is a Presbyterian theologian who teaches on a Jesuit faculty at St. Louis University. His interests include the relationship between geography and faith, wilderness backpacking in the Ozarks, the magic of storytelling, desert spirituality, exposing students to urban poverty through the Catholic worker community, and the poetry of Rumi. He's written many books that cover these topics, including one called Backpacking with the Saints, Wilderness Hiking as Spiritual Practice. And this book has spoken to my soul in ways I didn't know I needed. And he also, in all his free time, leads initiation rites through Richard Rohr's program for men as learners and elders in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Whew. So welcome, Professor Lane. We are so honored that you would join us today.
Thank you, Melanie. Happy to be here.
So Belden, Presbyterians and Jesuits, those that's some interesting faculty meetings, I would assume, right?
Yes. I was 35 years, I'm retired now, Professor Emeritus, but I was 35 years with the Jesuits, and it was a delight. Mm-hmm. A stretch on both sides, but a wonderful connection.
Wow. All right. So Melanie talked a little bit about your background, but we're going to dive deeper into that. In particular, for many of our listeners who are somewhere along the process of deconstructing their faith, potentially leaving faith altogether based on their frustrations with either evangelicalism and or the institutional church at large. And we have found and we have heard, not only from our listeners, but also ourselves, that this generation is looking for something deeper, something more transformative, and potentially even a new way of experiencing God. And that's why we're just incredibly delighted to speak with you because you have found that path. So, can you give us maybe a Reader's Digest version of your faith background and what brought you to studying mystical Christianity, the Desert Mothers and Fathers, and in particular the whole concept of experiencing God through nature and through wilderness?
Yeah. I was born outside Orlando, Florida, grew up there. And when I was 9 or 10, a revival tent, traveling revivalist, was put up across the street on a vacant lot. And my parents and I went. That led to the founding of a Bible church down the street. I'd not had a religious background before then, but I was fascinated by this story of Jesus and started to write my first book when I was 10 years old in a school spiral binder that I had at the time. So I grew up in Youth for Christ meetings. I went to Moody Bible Institute after high school. But the interesting thing along the way was that I never entirely fit in. Most people I knew could write in the front page of their Schofield Reference Bible the date and the time when they gave their heart to Jesus, when they had a conversion experience. And I never had a single one-time event like that. I always feared that I might be left behind at the rapture, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And I also loved the natural world. I grew up on a lake with cypress swamps nearby, wandering through pine forests, loving everything wild. And I was told that we weren't supposed to be attached to this world. We sang a gospel song, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond them." And yet that never really set right with me. In my own experience, God was as real in creation as God was in church. And I couldn't imagine God wanting to burn up this earth at the end of history. God for me was dancing in the flight of red-winged blackbirds and
Hmm.
the smell of orange blossoms. I needed wild things.
Mm.
And so I didn't find all of the God I wanted and needed especially in the particular religious background where I grew up.
Hmm. So then, how did you move out of that religious background and into something different?
Yeah. It was a long journey and putting myself in places where I might be vulnerable, dangerous places like wilderness seemed to be. I had an urge for that. It was the way the Spirit drew me as I look back on it now. I think I can say it better in a story.
Go for it.
Uh, Once upon a time, there was a Hasidic Rebbe whose little boy began leaving the synagogue each morning during his daily prayers. He went to wander in the woods. The boy loved being alone in the forest. But the father was concerned not just because the boy neglected his prayers, but because the woods were wild and dangerous there in the Carpathian Mountains where they lived. So the rabbi asked his son one day, "Why do you go out there alone in the forest? I noticed you've been doing it a lot lately." And the boy replied, "I go into the woods to find God." "Ah, that's wonderful," said his dad. "I'm glad you're searching for God, but you don't have to go anywhere special to find the Holy One, blessed be his name. God is the same everywhere." "Yes," the boy answered, "but I'm not. God may
Wow.
be the same everywhere, but I'm not." I love that because the boy knew there was something different about him when he was out in the wilds, out among tall, dark trees, out in the desert, wherever that might be. He was more receptive and open, more vulnerable out there. He knew that that landscape took him outside of himself and into the presence of God. And somehow I've known that all my life. That need to risk myself to solace and solitude and to find God as richly there uh, as within the community. That's still tremendously important for me.
Hmm.
Mm. Well, one thing that uh, as I started listening to your book, I felt my evangelical hackles kind of going up was like, everybody needs nature, sure, but like, how is that a spiritual practice to go out into the wild? And of course, you explain it so well in your book, but for those of us who haven't read your book, how would you explain that to them? How is the wild and the wilderness a spiritual practice?
Yeah, it's interesting too that how I was drawn into that more deeply. I did a lot of camping as a kid, but I didn't start backpacking as a spiritual practice until I turned 40 or so. And that's interesting. That's when I'd gotten tenure at a Jesuit university here in St. Louis, and I needed to be grounded again. I needed to get out of the ivory tower. Uh, I talked about God in the classroom, but I needed to spend time with God in the
Mm.
woods increasingly. And it's curious to me that's at midlife. Carl Jung says that that's when you make the shift from building a tower, creating a persona, finding a career, etc., to jumping off the tower, descending into a deeper sense of knowing who you are and who you really want to be, turning from the outer world of accomplishment into the inner wilderness of self-knowledge. And so I was drawn out there. John Muir, that old crusty post-Presbyterian lover of the High Sierras, he said, going out, I learned, was a way of going in. So I too needed the time for silence and solitude. And backpacking as a spiritual practice offered this. For example, it taught me the importance of traveling light, which is really crucial in one's spiritual life as well as your everyday life in a consumer society like ours. There's really very little I need in my life to be happy. Everything I need to eat, sleep, and stay warm can fit into the 30 pounds or so that I carry on my back.
Hmm.
Another thing that the trail teaches me is that there I have to pay attention. I have to be alert. I have to be mindful in a way that's not quite so necessary back at home. I
Mm.
need to keep attending to the trail where it might make a turn, to what the weather's doing, to what hot spot may be rubbing on inside my boot. So there's a mindfulness that I have to practice there that isn't so needed back home. And best of all, I think wilderness is an excellent place for making the necessary mistakes to get me to where I really need to go anyway. And that's learning to trust when I suddenly find that I'm not in control.
Hmm.
And there are many times out on the trail alone when you realize, oh my goodness, how did I get here? And learning to take a deep breath, to pray, and to find a way. So, in a variety of different ways like this, backpacking, it seems, has been a optimal spiritual practice, along with others, of course, in my personal life.
Hmm. So, in your book and in your writings, you link your desire to flee into the wilderness with a similar historical reality that's a very ancient practice in the church, and it's embodied by and lived out by the Desert Fathers, who, way back in the fourth century, left the center of culture, left the center of Christianity. Because it had become incredibly corrupt as the church got in bed with the state. And these desert fathers began to live on the margins of the empire out in the wilderness. So, if I'm not making too many assumptions here, it seems like that those desert fathers and those mystics have had an incredible impact on your spiritual journey as well as just on your wilderness experiences as well. Is that true? And if so, how?
Yeah, it definitely is true, Gary Allen. Um, and I'm intrigued not only by the desert mothers and fathers reacting to the dominant culture, but what they chose instead, and why they chose the wilderness, why they chose the desert west of the Nile.
Hmm.
Uh, I had years ago opportunity to hike through the desert around Mount Sinai. It was one of the great experiences of my life. The
Mm.
beauty and a kind of terror along with the austereness and loneliness of that landscape was amazing. It it takes you to the edge where you're not in control, where you have to find resources that you never imagined you had. And so the desert fathers and mothers chose this kind of geography because of the challenge it offered. I love it to put it plainly that they knew the desert didn't give a shit about them. It was utterly indifferent to the frantic needs of their ego, and that was profoundly important for them. They knew how ego-centered living had been the core of everything back in the society they'd left, and how do they find something different? And so this desert indifference teaches them a practice of spiritual holy indifference in their own lives. They called it apatheia. And I define that as a holy indifference to unimportant things. It's a wonderful desert discipline. What
Mm.
many of us need more than anything right now.
Mm.
Let me give an example. Once there was a young man in Alexandria who had heard so much about these wonderful desert fathers. And so one day he decided to walk into the desert to try to find them. And he came up to Abba Macarius, the abbot at one of the monasteries, and he said, "Oh, Father, I want to be a holy man, just like you. I've heard so much about you, amazing desert fathers. Can you teach me how to be a holy man? I'm only here for the weekend, but I really want to learn." Well, you can imagine Macarius smiling, but taking him seriously and saying, "All right. You'll see the cemetery just over the rise there. I want you to go over the rest of the day and abuse the dead for all that you're worth. I want you to yell at the dead people, throw stones at their graves, call them rotten thieves, terrible people who made the world worse for having lived, uh, and then come back and tell me what you heard." Well, the young man, think this is strange instructions. I'm learning how to be a holy man, but he does as he's told. Spends the rest of the day cursing the dead people. Comes back that evening, and Macarius said to him, "Well, what they say to you out there today?" "I didn't say anything." The young man said, "They were dead as doorknobs." "Oh, that's interesting," Macarius replied. "I want you to go back tomorrow and spend the day praising them. I want you to
Mm.
call them apostles and saints and righteous men and women. Think of every compliment you can, and just say everything nice that you can think of." Well, the young man once again did as he was told, returned to the cloister that evening, and Macarius asking this time, "What did they say today?" "Well, they didn't answer a word," replied the man. "Nothing more than yesterday." "Ah," said Macarius, "they must indeed be holy people. You insulted them and they did not reply. You praised them and they did not speak. Go and do
Mm.
likewise, my friend, taking no account of either the scorn of men and women or their praises, and you too will be a holy man." You see, what Macarius is inviting him to do is to learn, what do you ignore? And then what are you able to love? Those are the two great desert questions. They had left the desert because they knew the highest worth back in the city was given to consumerism and militarism and the careful cultivation of one's reputation. And so they came to the desert to learn not to care about what was unimportant, so as to begin to care about what really mattered. And that countercultural dimension of their powerful spirituality, of ignoring what doesn't matter and loving what really does, that for me is the core of the life I want to live, the years I have left.
Mm.
That's that's beautiful.
Mhm.
I'm speechless of how beautiful that is. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, they're full of stories like this. The sayings of the desert fathers and mothers are utterly amazing. I can't recommend them enough.
Mm.
As you know, Gary Allen.
Yeah, we're my wife and I are currently reading Thomas Merton's Sayings of the Desert Fathers,
Mm.
and we're just spending, some very meditative, contemplative time on each one of them. And then we're also reading the Gospel of Thomas to our kids. And,
Ah.
there's so many beautiful kind of riddles, if you will,
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
that Jesus posits that that keep you up at night, very similar to that same story. So we've lost a lot of those stories and those anecdotes, I think, in the church. We need to get
Yeah.
them back.
Absolutely.
Well, that's actually kind of something I was thinking about is, like, until I read your book, I'd heard, like, passing mention of the Desert Fathers, and rarely was it the Desert Fathers and mothers. And it was just kind of like, I don't know what that is. And it's like a history that I feel like has been lost in the modern evangelical church in the US. And so for people who have never even heard of them, like, where do you where do you start? How do you I don't even know names, honestly, because this is not something I was ever taught about, or it was never mentioned. So how do you even get started learning about them?
Yeah, I'd recommend two books. One by Benedicta Ward, a wonderful woman at Oxford. She edited the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And the other, you're right that we hear so much more about the fathers. There are about 107 desert fathers that we have sayings from, and only about 8 or 9 desert mothers.
Mm.
But there's a lovely book that Laura Swan, Swan, wrote a few years back called The Forgotten Desert Mothers. And she tells some of their stories, and they're amazing too. The work of historians today, of course, is to recover the voices that have been lost. And in a world of patriarchy, the women's voices were not heard, and they certainly deserve to be here.
Mm.
Mhm. Well, okay, so similar along those same lines, you often talk about the importance of risk and vulnerability in one's spiritual life, and then you tie that into how being taken to the edge physically also takes us to the edge spiritually. And one of the ways we can be taken to the edge spiritually, if we don't always have the time to be taken to the edge physically, is by reading, quote, dangerous books. And so I'm wondering, do you consider these books or books that have the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers dangerous? Or if not, what books are dangerous? And then also, I mean, I feel like I was raised to read only the books by approved authors or listen to sermons
Mhm.
by approved pastors, because we don't wanna be led astray after all. So why? Why is it important to read these quote unquote "dangerous books"?
Yeah, that's a good question. And these are dangerous books. These desert fathers and mothers. They are stepping like Thomas Merton, who steps back as a monk in a Kentucky monastery and is able to reflect on the society that he's left and offer a critique and a loving critique that's what draws so many of us to him. The insights that come and that really challenges us in hearing him. Catholic theologian David Tracy once said, in talking about books generally, that classics, the great classics of literature and of theology and anything, ought to be labeled dangerous books because they threaten to change your life.
Hmm.
Mm,
I remember when I was at Moody Bible Institute, for example, I read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov,
Mm.
maybe still the greatest novel I've ever read. And it rattled my cage. I loved the character Ivan, who was outraged that God could allow so much suffering in the world. And ideas like his didn't fit into my neatly tied up theology at the time.
mm,
Uh, and I know I still need to be shaken up and taken to the edge. I, uh, I can trust the Spirit of God speaking in me, helping me interpret whatever I read in a critical way, and yet in a way that opens me to new things that's incredibly important. Uh, and that's what wilderness is all about. It represents the risk and vulnerability that real growing faith always demands. So I love the fact that the German theologian Johannes Metz could speak of the dangerous memory of Jesus. The Jesus story, he said, is profoundly upsetting. If we really let it sink into us, it makes us question everything we might have thought about God in the past. It
Mm.
calls us again and again to the realities of love and the injustice and suffering in the world. And so for much of my life, I felt that I had to be safe in a secluded world, had to be protected, sheltered from anything out there in the world that would be dangerous. Because, I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. And I know God wants to challenge me, to make me uncomfortable with new things that will break me into a deeper understanding and acceptance of God's love for me and the world.
Hmm.
And I guess if you don't have this kind of both countercultural quality and openness to your culture, that if that's not a part of any authentic spirituality, it's just going to be a feel-good private practice.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm going to guess that you're a fan, or at least have read cultural historian and author Thomas Berry. And is that true? Am I making
Oh yeah,
too much? Okay, I figured you were. I figured you were. So, in one of his books, I'd love for you to respond to this, because I read this several years ago, and it really shook my entire understanding of God, um, and the whole notion of theism. Barry writes, he says, "The natural world is the larger sacred community to which we belong. The universe is the primary revelation of the divine, the primary scripture, the primary locus of divine human communion." And he seems to be pointing to a reality that we live in a wild, sacred universe. But most of us didn't grow up with that truth. We grew up with the idea that God was contained in the cathedral and not the forest, that
mm-hmm.
the only path to God is up the center aisle of the church, as opposed to down the dusty trail in the wilderness. So how do we recapture that whole concept of God being both transcendent and immanent, and very much alive in the tree and the grass and the flower and this beautiful holy world that we live in?
Yeah, it's all a matter of recovering a sense of awe, a sense of beginner's mind, to be able to see the world. I sat out in the gazebo in our backyard with my dog this morning, and just stunned on this beautiful St. Louis morning in the
Mm,
spring, by the birds, the new leaves all around me. Uh, and Richard Rohr, my teacher and dear friend, says that the incarnation is really at the heart of our Christian faith, my Christian faith, and that in a deep sense, the first incarnation is in creation itself, the very creation of matter, of thisness, there-ness, what would just drove Teilhard de Chardin crazy, the wonder that there is something here, and there's something so beautiful, and that in the Big Bang, as it were, how many million years ago, that God suddenly brought into being matter.
mm,
And then the second incarnation, as it were, as Christians understand it, would be the coming of God into matter squared, as it were. God entering spirit, entering into the matter, into flesh, and inviting us to that union of flesh and spirit, matter and divinity, that is at the core of what Jesus wanted to uh, do, to invite us to be sons and daughters of God as well. Uh, I, I I think when I was growing up, we forgot how many times God said in Genesis 1, "It's good, I like it." Each
Hmm.
of those first 6 days of creation, uh, and the wonder of the earth.
mm,
Hmm.
I also think that it's a problem of ecclesiology, that our ecclesiology needs to be challenged today. We assume that the family of God is limited exclusively to human beings. We're the only one God really cares about. The rest of the world is simply a backdrop and window dressing for the human drama. And that's why Thomas Berry, and I do love him, my latest book, The Great Conversation, Nature and the Care of the Soul, is about his saying we've dropped out of the great conversation. We've lost our ability to converse with the rest of the natural world. We're talking only to ourselves, he complained. We're not talking to the rivers. We aren't listening to the wind and stars. We've broken the great conversation. And that's a great loss. How can we become more inclusive to recognize that all of reality is embraced in God's, the great arms reaching out in God's love? So when we ask, how can we be more inclusive? I love it. A few years ago, I think it was the Methodists, they started to ordain pastoral dogs to participate in worship and the ministry of the church. I
What?
have a
That's amazing. Oh my
dog
gosh.
sitting at my feet right now.
My dog
Joey.
would not qualify. I know that. No way. No way.
Some dogs do. They would have them process down the aisle with clergy at the beginning of the service. They'd even have a stole of their own that they'd wear around their necks. They'd lie in the chancel as worship proceeded, and then they would make pastoral calls on the sick and shut-ins during the week. And it's a great symbolic action of embracing all of the family of God, in the praise and wonder that the psalmist is always saying. The trees are clapping their hands, the mountains are singing for joy. Why do we leave them out?
Mm. I just feel I love that so much. I want to go to that one of those churches now. But I also feel myself going, or at least my training going, but humans are at the top. Humans, like, if it comes down to it, we have to choose humans because God gave us special, I don't even know what, but we're special in
Status,
some
maybe.
way. Yeah. And so, and it's our job to harness and have dominion over. Dominion's a big word right now in the super
Yeah,
conservative
yeah.
world. And so, like, what do you say to that? Like,
Well, as Jesus said to his disciples at the Last Supper, being at the top means being a servant to others. And so that there is an important sense in that humans bring something distinctive into creation. They bring consciousness. They bring an ability to be mindful, to observe, to give praise, to celebrate, to put into words, to be poetic, to create poetry as a way of inviting the rest of the world into a deeper consciousness and celebration of God's presence and reality. And so it's not that we exercise a power over, we exercise a consciousness with and for, so as to love the earth in its vulnerability today. When I go hiking, I do a lot of hiking in southern Missouri. It's in the lead belt, and I will pass through mine tailings and polluted streams, and the earth cries out. And so the consciousness I bring, hopefully in my writing, in how I speak to and for the earth, in calling us to a common community in which we all belong. Everything belongs.
One thing that it seems like, in order for us to have this communion with God through wilderness or through nature, we just have to be insanely intentional. Because I'm thinking about my own experience. My husband I think his childhood was a lot like yours, Belden, where he was out in the woods all the time, running around. He just loved it. And now he's um, an alpinist, and he ice climbs. And I mean, he's just always looking for new ways to get outside. And I, on the other hand, am very much not like that. I mean, I spent a lot of time outside as a kid in New Mexico. We didn't have forests, so we played with tumbleweeds. But I was outside, but like the idea of going into these places that are scary and that will require something of me that I don't know if I even have it in order to get out of it alive, that's terrifying to me. And it's not something that comes naturally to me at all. And yet, through my husband, I've been able to experience that. So for people who might not be so inclined, or maybe just don't even have the opportunity right now,
Yeah.
how can they have this similar experience?
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'd want to insist that there is wilderness all around us. We don't have to go to wild places as such, like your husband climbing on ice.
Yeah.
Uh, as marvelous as that might be. Louis Agassiz was a naturalist. He taught at Harvard over 100 years ago. And one fall, he came back to classes and he told his students, I spent the summer traveling and I got halfway across my backyard. That sense of attentiveness to the wonder and awe that is everywhere around us. What I have done often in classes is to take students on a micro hike where they have a tent stake and a 15-inch length of string. They put it anywhere they want in the grass outside the classroom building and spend the rest of the class period just studying what's within the diameter of
Hmm.
that little circle. And it's amazing, utterly amazing what you find of beauty and wonder and shock and surprise right in your own backyard. So I don't think I should have said this a long time ago, and I appreciate your bringing it up. It's not a matter of going into explicitly dangerous territory. It's a matter of making yourself vulnerable to everywhere you are, and there's wonder in every backyard. Thank you, thank you.
Hmm.
Well, even for the most ardent conservative, we even see this whole notion of finding and experiencing the sacred in the wilderness in our narratives that are so beautiful in Scripture. So this isn't some new age thing, like this isn't something that you've invented. I mean, we can think of Hagar finding God in the wilderness, and actually, it was a very different God than her taskmasters
Mhm.
masters had made out to be. We see Jesus going into the wilderness to experience an initiatory experience, almost a vision quest, if you will, before he launches his ministry. We see Moses in the burning bush. So these are not anti-Judeo-Christian concepts. They are rooted within the very fabric of our ancient tradition, and yet, as we said earlier, they've almost been lost. So, is there a practical way that we can help people maybe tiptoe back into that? Maybe I'm not ready to go out into the wilderness per se to be completely vulnerable, but I want to experience God in nature. And what's maybe a first step to integrate the notion of the sacramental incarnational understanding of creation for even the most conservative among us?
I One of my most important teachers is a 100-year-old cottonwood tree that lives in the park across the street from my house. I've known him for 30 years. There were originally two great trunks growing out of his roots, but one of those was struck down by lightning in a fierce storm 30 years ago. And I go over to the huge 12-foot high wound in the side of that tree. I go there every night to pray, to be still. I lean into the hollow of this old tree, and it's like standing in the wounded side of Christ.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a deep sense of comfort, of being held in this tree. And the tree, strange as it sounds, has been a means of helping me reconnect with the Jesus of my childhood as never before. So what I often suggest to people as a general or beginning spiritual practice in getting out into nature is to take a walk in a park nearby or even in one's backyard. Uh, Stop at a particular place and as if you recognize you're going to cross a threshold and ask at that place, ask permission to enter, knowing that you want God to be present to you and you want to be sensitive to that presence in a specific intentional way as you cross this threshold and ask for permission to come and for ability to really be open. And then as you move through that, to find a tree that you might be drawn to, maybe a wounded tree, and to sit with that tree, to let it tell you its story, to in turn then tell your story of the woundedness in your life, to thank the tree when you're done, to come back to that same place, that threshold, to give thanks. I don't know how many people I've worked with who have incredible stories to tell about trees uh, and their personal faith experience.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I feel like we could ask you so many more questions. I have many in my head right now, but um, we are needing to wrap it up. So I want to ask you the question that we try to ask everyone. So for you, coming from the more fundamentalist background and now as a Presbyterian who worked with Jesuits for so long and through all these experiences, um, not only with different faiths, but also with um, the natural world. From your vantage point, what gives you hope when you look at the future of faith?
Hands down, it's my 5-year-old granddaughter, Ellie, the only grandchild we have, whose daddy, our son, died of cancer this last year.
Hmm.
Mm,
The last 6 months have been some of the hardest of our lives.
mm,
And she is learning, we are learning, slowly but surely, with Julian of Norwich, that all will be well.
mm,
Mm.
I don't understand why at 41 my son was suddenly struck down with cancer. Why little Ellie would come last week and say, Babu, that's what she calls me. What if Mama should die too? Do I have to live in my house all alone?
Mm.
mm,
And this beautiful child struggling, wanting to be loved, wanting not to be abandoned, wanting to be
mm,
sure that there is hope, and looking to me and Grammy, Trisha, my wife, and the love, the trust that child has, uh, it just blows me away. And so that gives me hope more than anything. Also, remembering standing on the beach at Clearwater, Florida, looking out at the dark red setting sun over the Gulf of Mexico, as people all around suddenly spontaneously broke into applause at the sheer wonder of it. There are so many things to give us wonder and so many things to give us hope, even in the midst of suffering. And so, it's curious as I was thinking about preparing for this, talking with you. In many ways, I am more evangelical. I'd call myself more evangelical now than I ever was growing up,
Mm.
mm,
because the faith I now have is a good news that
Mm.
God isn't into vengeance and punishment and judgment. That's not the first thing to be said about God, and the first thing to be said about me is not original sin. But the first thing to be said is that God is love, and that God made me and us in love. That God doesn't inflict suffering, but God walks with us through suffering.
mm,
Uh, that is evangelical. That is good news.
mm.
Mm.
Amen.
Amen.
Right. Hey, well, first of all, thank you for trusting us and this space to share that sacred story and to share that pain. It was a true honor to hear you talk about your son, and
Thank you.
yeah, we could hear that in your voice, and just we want to acknowledge that.
Mm.
Thank you for
Mhm.
that. That was incredibly vulnerable and beautiful at the same time. So we do want to end our time with a little bit of more levity, if that's okay. I know we've had some
Sure.
deep conversations here about beauty and wonder as well as loss. but based on your background and based on your passions, especially in relation to backpacking, is there a place that you want to go backpacking that you just haven't been to yet? And what would that place be?
Oh, there's a place. It's one I have been to many times. In fact, I've been invited to go back to Ghost Ranch in New Mexico this coming August. They're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the movie City Slickers with Billy
Mm.
Crystal, and I'm asked to speak about that, to talk about the hero's journey in connection with the film, which is a fascinating one about wilderness experience. Uh, but I've really been drawn to canyons again. The canyons of the Red Rock country there at Ghost Ranch north of Santa Fe is just utterly beautiful and haunting. And so there's a lot that I need to pour out in terms of what's been in me this last year, and a return to joy, holy folly, the mystery of the holy fool that laughs uh, with joy on the graves of death, like the early Christians did, amazingly.
Mm.
The desert calls me again. So hopefully I'll be going out there early in August.
You're speaking my language right now because most of the exploring that we've been doing in Utah lately is to the slot canyons.
Yeah,
And I've I've been in the mountains. I've been um, to the beach. I've been to a lot of places, and there's something about the Utah desert that just I, it's it's beyond words for me. So you're speaking my language. I'm actually from Albuquerque. I don't know if you knew that. So it's cool that you are doing those programs with Richard Rohr and also, spending time in New Mexico. So I'm wondering, out of all the exploring you've had time to do in New Mexico, what your favorite place is.
that uh, that area around Ghost Ranch and Christ in the Desert Monastery
Mm. Hmm. Yep.
that Thomas Merton said was the most sacred place in America. Uh, he stopped there on his way to Asia.
Mm.
Uh, that whole area, it's along the trail that goes from north to south, the Continental Trail.
Oh,
Yeah,
the Continental Trail. Okay.
yeah,
Nice. Nice.
Hmm.
yeah. That place is incredibly powerful to me. I can tell my wife she can spread my ashes there.
Nice. So, in all your wilderness adventures, have you ever gotten lost? And if so, what happened to you?
Yeah. I've often been the most times I've been lost is in my head,
Hmm.
where I've thought suddenly I hadn't been paying attention and nothing looks familiar. And I backtrack on the trail and it still doesn't look familiar. And the panic begins to build up. And I think, oh my God, I'm here in the middle of nowhere. And what am I going to do? And to sit down, to calm myself, to be still, and then to begin maybe to make concentric circles around where I've been, and to keep connecting with the point where I left off. Uh, Invariably, I'll discover, I hadn't gotten lost at all. I hadn't been far away from where I'd been in the least. It was all being lost inside my head,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Hmm.
It does.
Yeah. So there's a famous furniture line called Belden Lane. Do you also dabble in furniture design? Is that you?
No, but my name is interesting. My name's Belden Lane. Uh, my full given names. The first two, Belden are Cornish names from I'm named after a great grandfather in Cornwall,
Hmm.
and they mean Belden means beautiful green hill in Cornwall. Kerno is the Gaelic Cornish word for Kerno for Cornwall. So I am a Green Hill in Cornwall by name. Went there with the family years ago to try to find a place. I found a hill that I could call my own. But it's interesting,
Wow.
to be named after a place where you've never been is an intriguing thing in my life, given my love of
Mhm.
geography.
Cornwall is absolutely beautiful.
Oh,
All right,
yeah.
our last question. I noticed in an article you'd written that you referenced some of your favorite authors, including Marcus Borg, Bernard of Clairvaux, Dorothy Day, and then that kind of radical heretic, John Shelby Spong. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, this is a kindred spirit who is just further along the path than myself. So if you could recommend one book or author besides your own to introduce our listeners to the sacred divine nature of the world, what would that book be?
Hmm. I love Teilhard de Chardin, the heart of matter, and even more the divine milieu.
Mm,
This Jesuit who had a stunning mystical sense of God's presence in matter, in the world. Uh, I just love his work.
mm. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Professor Lane, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for your words, for your heart, your tenderness, and your invitation for all of us to step outside to go beyond the safe confines of our world, both physically and spiritually. So, for anyone who wants more, where can they find you or your books online?
Uh, uh, Amazon. There's 6 books I think available there. That'd probably be or uh, Google Sites, Belden Lane. Yeah, thank you. And it's been a delight, Melanie and Gary Allen, talking with you.
Mhm.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so
It's
much for
been
joining
an
us.
honor.
Yes, we have loved it so much, and I just feel like just listening to you, my soul is being spoken to in ways that I didn't experience elsewhere. So thank you for that.
Mm,
Thank you.
absolutely.
That is it for this week. Don't forget to sign up for our live digital course, Making Sense of the Bible Post Deconstruction, before registration closes on July 1st. Head to www.sophiasociety.org and tap on the announcement bar at the top to get all the details and learn how to register. That's SOPHIA society.org. This episode was produced by the Sophia Society. Music is by Faith in Foxholes, and sound engineering is by Joshua Mudge.